Hi boys, in this video I'm going to explain the changes in the nature versus nurture debate over time. I have two young boys here helping me, so apologies for any background noise you hear. Alright, let's get into it. So the reason I wanted to make this video is some of you might have missed the class where we went over the exercises and activities to understand how both sides of the debate have changed over time, and also hopefully you'll know what the current state of the debate is. It's dead, right? We don't think it's nature or nurture, it's nature via nurture. All right. So remember, what is the big question in psychology? It might help to come back to that point, right? The big question is, how and why do humans think and act the way we do? So Galton, who did the first twin study, believed it was genetics. We do the things we do because of our genes. Watson came along and said, it's because of conditioning. Bandura said, it's maybe because of social learning, right? And lots of other psychologists have their opinions. Don't play with the keys, mate. All right. So we played a Kahoot in this lesson to review. Sorry if you missed that. And on Schoolbox, you'll find this worksheet that we also work through, which is double-sided, that will help you understand what we knew then and what we know now. Let's look at the nature side of the debate first. But before we get there, it's important that you understand, how do you explain a change in the debate and the changing over time? You have to first identify, well, they used to think this and now they think this, and therefore is the change. I've seen some students struggle with this. They just write a one-sentence summary of what we now know and they forget to identify what we used to know. So in order to explain how the debate has changed, we have to know what did we used to think and what do we know now. And this is really important in psychology because maybe a lot of what we're learning in psychology will one day prove to be false. A lot of what we used to think in psychology has since, with new data, proven incorrect. And this can happen in a really quick, short time span sometimes. Power posing, the way you stand, can boost your testosterone and boost your confidence. This became a hugely famous TED Talk and a very popular book. And only a few years later, it's kind of been debunked. So we're changing what we know in psychology all the time, which is why we need to understand how that process happens in order for you to be a good psychologist. Right, let's look at three examples from the nature argument. Galton in 1875, the relative of Darwin, set out to prove that genetics influences behavior. Right, you are eminent, successful in life based on your genes. However, Rain, much more recently, the most famous criminologist today, he did a study with Baker, and they found that your heritability, the extent to which your behavior is inherited, is about 50%. So what does that suggest? Well, the other 50% must come from non-genetic factors, i.e. the environment. So the fact that we've got this phrase heritability, which is meaning it's really the extent to which variations in behavior are inherited, that shows us a change in the debate, because we're not just looking at, is it solely genetics or the environment? It's the combination of the two. And Rain's new research shows that. So we used to think it was all genetics. Now we know it's a combination. Similarly, the process of epigenetics, which is the interaction of the environment and genetics, shows a change in the debate. Again, Galton and others used to think that our behavior was purely genetic. Now we know, and we look at this is a sample out of the Dunedin study, that just if you have a particular gene variant like the MAOA, the warrior L, right, MAOA L variant, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be more antisocial. In fact, you've got lower levels. However, if you combine that with childhood maltreatment, that's when the problems occur. So this understanding now of epigenetics, which is an interaction between the environment and genes, shows how our understanding of the nature via nurture has changed since Galton's early years. A big change in our understanding of neuroplasticity, or how the brain worked, is before the 1960s, the belief was that the brain was pretty fixed, permanent, and stable. Your brain developed up until about the age of 3 or 4, and then that was your brain. You had that for life, and it didn't change much. However, beginning with early studies on rats in the 1960s, using different environments, they found that actually your environment, how you grow up, can change the shape of your brain and change the structure of your brain. The development of brain imaging technologies in the 1980s rapidly helped that advancement. We can scan people's brains before and after and over long periods of time and compare groups of people's brains without having to wait for them to die, right? And we've seen the brain changes throughout our lifespan. So this understanding of neuroplasticity, your brain's ability to change, and the fact that it changes throughout your life, is a big change in the nature argument. I haven't talked about this in class before. I might have mentioned it briefly, but just a final one. Phrenology was quite popular in the early 1800s. This was the idea that bumps on your head could dictate your personality and different character traits. It was pseudoscience. It was large. It's now debunked. There's no merit to these claims. There's no data to support it. However, we do have loads of data, from animal studies and brain imaging studies of the localization of function, the fact that yes, in fact, your brain does have different components, and these different components perform different functions. You've learned about the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex and how it regulates behavior, and the amygdala deep down in the middle there about how that influences our emotions, particularly our negative emotions and anger. So we used to believe in phrenology. That's right, mate. We used to believe in phrenology, and now we know, well, the concept was right, but actually the facts were wrong. Localization, we do know now that different parts of our brain perform specific functions. So that is how the nature argument has changed. Feel free to come up with others that are outside these examples, but these are the ones that we've been focusing on. Now let's look at the nurture side of the debate. Did I change? Nurture, yes, right. Nurture begins with Pavlov, really, that side of the argument, although he was a biologist, not a psychologist. But we could say that one change in the nurture argument was that Watson took Pavlov's ideas and said, will this apply to humans? And he famously showed that in the Little Albert experiment. So one thing, the nature side, the biological side of stuff, it was often proving things wrong and kind of correcting it. The nurture side of the argument, the changes aren't so much improving things wrong, but they're more about in development and adding to the nurture argument. So for example, Pavlov and Watson wasn't out to prove Pavlov wrong and show he was incorrect. He wanted to see would that apply to humans, and then that's how he come up with behaviorism and classical conditioning. Similarly, Watson was all about classical conditioning, right? The learning by association between two stimuli. Skinner, Watson's student, took that and said, well, what about rewards and punishments? Can we condition people using rewards and punishments? And he came up with operant conditioning. And he famously tried to teach pigeons to drop bombs, and he got funding from the military, and that was going to be a big project. And he went back to animal studies and did most of his research on animals. So again, the change here is the addition of operant conditioning to classical conditioning. So now the behaviorists have two key arguments in their behavior is nurture argument. And also, Skinner was the one who popularized or repopularized the idea there's no such thing as free will. All our behavior is based on our environment and conditioning. Now, similarly, Bandura didn't come along and try to prove these guys wrong. He conceded and agreed that yes, behaviorists are right, that conditioning does occur. It can explain behavior. But what Bandura said was, actually, it's not the only explanation for behavior. We can also learn by observing others and imitating and copying it. It doesn't always have to be about rewards and punishments or, maybe, 2 minutes. It doesn't always have to be about conditioning. So again, he adds another arrow into the nurture argument. It can be classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and it can also be observational learning, demonstrated with his famous Bobo doll study. Now, Bandura then also, though, his original theory was published in the 1960s. By the 1980s, thanks to some of the discoveries I've talked about, like neuroplasticity and epigenetics, Bandura updates his theory from social learning theory to social cognitive theory. This is a significant change. And it is where Bandura is really recognizing, like those on the side of the nature argument, that, hey, in fact, it is nature via nurture. Our behavior is the product of a combination of environmental factors like observational learning and personal factors like our self-efficacy, like our biology, like our genetics, right? And our environment, like our culture. So all these factors shape behavior. I hope that explains how the debate has changed over time. If you can explain neuroplasticity, epigenetics, and triadic reciprocal determinism, you can show the interactions of the debate, and also that what we now know. It went from being nature or nurture, now it's nature via nurture. If you want, here's a kind of some key dates of nature, of how things happen, just to get some context. All right, and then did I forget? I thought I had some key dates of nurture. They'll be on some other slides somewhere that you can find. All right, I hope that was helpful.